All right, it's good to be back again tonight. It's our last night, and I've really enjoyed coming and teaching this year, and I hope that everybody's got something out of it. Let me encourage everybody to, as soon as you get the final test, and they're up online, I've already got several back, and I appreciate those that have been so quick in getting their tests back, but do those, send them back in, we'll get the final grades, and we have some graduating in June, so we'll try to get all the grades done by then. So please continue to be diligent in that. We appreciate that. I know it's a lot of work, it's a lot of reading, but here's the last night, and we're going to go to the Lord in prayer, and then I'm just going to give you something that's not in the book tonight. I got real close to the end. I'm just going to be satisfied with that. But you read the book. It's a great book. Next time I'm praying about thinking about using a different book, and so that'll be a few years to decide. But those that are coming back in the fall, I'll go ahead and make this announcement. If you have a copy of Kingdom of the Cults, that's going to be the class that I'll be teaching in the fall. And so a good, relaxing summer read would be to read Kingdom of the Cults, especially if you are have insomnia, if you have problems sleeping, or if you're not depressed and you'd like to be, read Kingdom of the Cults. Now, there's a lot of good information in there, and it's a rather large book, so if you want to go ahead and start reading, go ahead and start on that. All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer, and then we'll get started tonight. And we had several things that were mentioned in Brother Tull's class. We're trying to remember those, and let's remember one another as well. So let's go to the Lord in prayer, and then we'll get started. Lord, we come today unworthy as we are. Lord, we are thankful for the Word of God. We're thankful, Lord, for the classes we've already heard tonight. We sang about what Brother Tull was talking about. Lord, if we treated you like we treated, or if we treated the Lord, Lord, what he was saying, you're faithful, and many times we're not. If we treated you or our jobs like we treat you sometimes, Lord, we wouldn't have a job. We'd just be in a mess. Lord, I'm thankful for your grace, your mercy, your loving kindness towards us, and we are thankful that we have the school. We're thankful for the students. I pray you bless each and every one. Help us, Lord, to have a good summer. Keep us safe in our travels. All the revivals that are coming up, a lot of things, Lord, we've got scheduled and plans for, but we realize that all of that is just Lord willing. And so I pray you'd help us tonight, and I pray, Lord, that you would help us as we go home in a little while. We're thankful for all the many blessings you've given to us, and I pray for good liberty tonight, and I pray that you would help us, and we'll thank you for all that you do. We come asking these things in Jesus' name, and amen. We're going to look in 1 Corinthians chapter number 9 tonight, and so that's where we're going to start. And I'm going to teach a little lesson. This is some of this is in the book. It's all tied in with the book, sort of appendix type information, you might say, to the book and the lessons in the book. But what I want to teach on tonight is how an understanding of history will help you be a better preacher, pastor, missionary, evangelist, teacher, whatever type of ministry that God has called you into. It will help you to have an understanding of history. It will help you to understand the people you're ministering to. If I was going to a foreign field, I would learn the history of that people. It'll help you be a better preacher. It'll help you be a better missionary. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Here's the ministry philosophy of the Apostle Paul. Look what he says. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse number 19. He said, "For though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more." And look what he says. "And unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as them that are under the law. To them that are without law, as without law." He's talking about the Gentiles. He said, to them that are without law is without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And then in verse 23, and this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker thereof with you. And so we find something there about the ministry philosophy of the Apostle Paul. The word philosophy, the way I'm using that, is Webster's Dictionary says this: the objects of philosophy are to ascertain facts or truth and the causes of things. True religion and true philosophy must ultimately arrive at the same principle. True religion and true philosophy must ultimately arrive at the same principle. And so we look at our verses tonight, what they're teaching us. Paul understood his audience. He understood who he was preaching to, who he was ministering to. He said, to the Jew, I became as a Jew. To those that are without law, talking about the Gentiles, he understood them. To the weak, he became weak. And look what he says there in verse number 22. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And then he said, this I do for the gospel's sake. And so he knew his audience. He knew about the Jews. He knew about the Gentiles. He knew about people. He was a people person. He understood people. And we could ask ourselves a question, how much do I really understand the people I'm preaching to? How much can I relate to them? Do I understand where they're coming from? I'll be honest, as a younger preacher, well, I couldn't, there's a lot of people in church I could not relate to. When I started preaching, I hadn't been married but just a few years. I didn't have children. I couldn't really relate to parents until I became a parent. And then, I could preach on raising them babies, 6 months old, a year old. But I hadn't had a 2-year-old yet. I hadn't had a 5-year-old yet. I hadn't had teenagers yet. Oh, it's real easy to preach how people ought to raise their teenagers until you get some of them things on your own. And then, it's you gain an understanding. You can't really relate to people. You can't say, I know how you feel to somebody whose dad or mom just passed away and you've never had that experience in your life. You don't know how they feel. You feel for them, you pray for them, but you've never been there. And so with life comes experience. And as we experience things, we can relate to people. And we can understand where they're coming from. We have walked in the shoes they're walking in. And so that goes a long ways in understanding who we're preaching to. When I was called to be a missionary to the state of Idaho, we went out there in the year 2000. We stayed till 2004. And the first time I went out west, first few times I went out west, I had people out there, missionaries out there. They said, now, when you come out here, you can't preach out here like you do in North Carolina. I had a lot of different preachers tell me that. And, I thought, well, why not? And they would say, they're different. They're different out here. And that sort of, being a lot younger at the time, I wondered about that. How it's easy to say in your mind, well, we'll see about that. You might go out there and change, but I'm not going to go out there and change. That's sort of the attitude you might have. But you know what? I got out there, and they were right. And they're not saying you can't preach the same message. I never had trouble preaching the same message, but what it really boils down to is people out west were different. And I did not find that I had the same liberty out west that I might have in a church in North Carolina or Tennessee or Virginia where I was around people that I could say, well, we're pretty much all the same. They are different. You go different places, they're different. I found this: if you'll just preach with the liberty that God gives you, you'll be fine. If you try to force something, if you go somewhere and say, well, I'm going to preach like I always preach, and for some people, preaching in and of itself is a culture shock. They've never heard it. The only place they've ever heard somebody raise their voice is at a ball game. Yeah. Certainly not in church if they've ever been. So just the going and hearing somebody raise their voice or be animated in the way they speak, it's culture shock to them, and they might just be enjoying the show. They've not heard a thing you've said. They're scared of you. I've had people say, well, I'm not coming to your church. I'm scared. It's culture shock to them. They are different. But if you just I never had trouble preaching. It's not that I didn't have liberty. I just didn't have the same kind of liberty. And so you'll go different places, and people are different. Why are they different? A lot of the times why they're different, if we knew our history, we could understand why these people are the way they are. What would Paul do if he went somewhere different? He said, to the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. If we are not willing to do that, we're going to lose some people. If we're not willing to get on the level that people are. If we're not willing to minister to them where they are. Now, I have several missionary friends that are up north, in the northern states. And they're different up there. I'm going to, Lord willing, preach in a revival in June in New York City. I already expect that it's going to be a little bit different. There's a language barrier sometimes. And so I'm just expecting that. I realize it will be a little bit different, but I'm excited about it and looking forward to it. But I had one of my missionary friends in a good church, a good pastor. And we think nothing in the South of having an altar call. We might be surprised if we went to church and had the singing, had the preaching, and didn't have an altar call. We're used to that. But one of my friends that pastors a church up north, he said that he had somebody come to him after a service, and he was talking about the altar call, and he said, we're not going down there. We're not a bunch of Catholics. See, they have a whole different mindset of what it means to go to the altar, to kneel at an altar. And they're rejecting a lot of the way that they were raised in just being religious and lost. And so to them, it's a whole different mindset. And so they had in their minds, we're not going to the altar. We're not bowing down. We're not a bunch of Catholics. And so why are they like that? If you know their history, you'll know why they're like that. And so understanding history helps us understand the people that we're ministering to. Now, there's a lot of reasons why people are the way they are, but a lot of the reason is historical reasons and even regions of our country. And I want to give you some information. I believe it'll just help you. We have a lot of students from a lot of different places. It wouldn't really matter where you were from, but I believe this will help you where you minister, especially if it's here in the United States. There were 4 major migrations from Britain before the American Revolutionary War. And these migrations of people pre-1776 were the Puritans first, the Cavaliers and indentured servants second, the Quakers third, and then the Scot-Irish and Northern Border Englishmen. And this is pretty much how the United States was early populated, by these 4 migrations from Europe, specifically Britain. They all had a different mindset concerning what liberty was. And this will help us understand as well who we're ministering to. and even some of the things that go on in our country today. So we're going to take each one of those one by one, and then we'll be done tonight. But first of all, and we've studied this in our church history, first of all, the Puritans. The Puritans, 1629 to 1641. So a time period of about 11 to 12 years, they settled primarily in Massachusetts. They came during that 11, 12-year time period, approximately 21,000 Puritans came. Now, if you really think about that, that's not a lot of people. Our college football stadium over at Appalachian, it's not really a big stadium, but it's pretty big. When it is packed, you can fit 22 or 23,000 people in there. So relatively speaking, that's not a lot of people. If you go down here to the Tennessee Volunteers, their stadium holds over 100,000 people. If you put 21,000 people in that stadium, the announcers would look around and they'd say, nobody's here today. Nobody came out to the game. And so 21,000, but you got to realize they're coming 25, 30 people at a time in boats across the Atlantic Ocean. And so it took a while. But they came to this country mainly because of religious persecution. Others came as well. Some of them came, they got saved when they got over here. We studied about Roger Williams, John Clark, many others. But a lot of them came as Puritans. The Puritans, they did believe in liberty, but they believed in ordered liberty. Ordered liberty was imposed by their magistrates. Now, magistrate's sort of like a sheriff. And we went up a few years ago to Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg. That is a great trip. I love that. I'd like to go back without the kids because what I wanted to do, they didn't want to do. I wanted to go to Jamestown, look around and read all the plaques. They wanted to go ride rides and all that bunch of stuff. But what little bit I got to part that I got to enjoy, I really enjoyed it. And you walk down, they've got like old, how it would have been back in that time period. And you walk along, and they have the stocks out there, and they had stocks, and you can try them out, see if you like being put in the stocks. And you sit down on the ground on some of them, put your feet in it and your hands in it, and I'll tell you about 1 minute in, you are suffering. They'd put you in the stocks if you weren't in church on Sunday. They'd put you in the stocks. They'd do all kinds of things. That their ordered liberty is this mindset. It's not that they didn't believe in liberty, but they just believed in ordered liberty. And ordered liberty is this: the important issue was what is done was done for the good of the whole community. The Puritans came over together. They worked together. They built the first common house, which is a hospital, together. The Pilgrims, and then later the Puritans. And so what's good for the whole community? What is best for everyone? And under ordered liberty, what's best for everyone is for everyone to go to church. And so if you're not in church on Sunday, you're in trouble with the law. They even made the Indians go to church. They made everybody go to church. What's best for everybody is that everybody would baptize their baby when they're born. So you bring your child. That's what's best for everybody. And so that is the mindset of ordered liberty. They were a lot like the Pharisees in the Bible. Very strict, very law-oriented, quick to punish, quick to impose fines, penalties, all of these things. A part of ordered liberty is also this: the idea of freedom from fear. They believe that the government should provide freedom from fear. And if you think about that, freedom from fear gave rise in our country to the idea that all of society's problems could be solved by the government. Of course, we know that's not right. But we see that mindset even today. The mindset of, if you start a business, you shouldn't fail. And people get in their mind that this should be a right, that they should be able to live without fear. Well, if you do anything, there's a risk involved. There's a of fear involved. The government cannot solve all of our problems. But there's a lot of people in our country, even today, that feel like the government ought to solve all the problems. The government ought to fix the environment. The government ought to fix the economy. The government ought to fix health care. They ought to fix everything so we can live without any type of fear. That's a little bit about the Puritans. They came first. Second, there was from 1642 to 1675. The Cavaliers came. The Cavaliers and their indentured servants. A nice way to put that is their slaves. They came with their slaves. The Cavaliers, approximately 50,000 came during that early time period. They settled mainly in Virginia over a time period of about 33 years. So 50,000 came. They came from southern England. They came because of fleeing civil war in England. Also strife. I'd never watched until a few years ago the movie Gone with the Wind. You know, I've heard about it all my life. But if you watch Gone with the Wind, and that's a long movie, it's like 3 or 4 hours long. Maybe that's with the commercials, I don't know. But we watched it, Kim and I, and it was snowing outside, and we didn't have anything else to do. So we said, we'll watch this movie. We'd never seen it before. But in that movie, it talks about the Cavaliers, their land, their slaves, their aristocracy. Talks about all that stuff in that movie. And at the beginning of the movie, the Civil War starts. And all the people are running around, and they're all hooping and hollering, and you know, boy, they're going to go off, and they're going to settle this thing, and they'll be back in a month or two. And so that's how it all starts. And the movie goes on and on. I can't remember a whole lot about it. But these people in that movie, they live on plantations. They're wealthy landowners. They all own slaves. They live in mansions, all of that. You notice there's not a whole lot of that around here. Where do you have to go to find that? Virginia, down in the lowlands of North Carolina, a little bit, not a lot. But when you think about that, you think about Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, plantations, things like that, where they had large land and slaves and cotton and all of that stuff. Most of those people were Anglicans. Most of those people were Episcopalians. That was their religion. But when the Civil War was over and slavery was ended, then that lifestyle was pretty much gone with the wind. That's the thing. That's the thing of that movie. I never realized it. I got something out of it because of knowing the history of it. But they believed in dominion liberty. Now they are well born, a lot of them, the aristocrats, the Cavaliers. They believe in dominion liberty, which is this: only free-born Englishmen had liberty. So they had liberty, but not the slaves, certainly. And among them, the wealthiest had more liberty. The aristocrat had the most liberty. That would be somebody that had ties to royalty in England, Lord so-and-so, and maybe somebody had a big land grant when they came over here or something like that. Under dominion liberty, they would have the most liberty. And there's still that type of thinking in America today. And mainly up around Virginia, up around Washington, D.C. You think about the politicians, you think about a lot of the people that go up there, and they pass laws for us, but they don't live by the same laws. That's that same mindset that we're just a little bit above everybody else. And even though the plantations are gone and the slaves are no more, there's still that mentality by some. You know, we are privileged, more privileged. A lot of times people that have money think that they have more rights, more liberty than others. And so you still have that mindset today. They believed in social independence. And what that means is this: a person has a right to do as they please on their own land without being interfered by somebody else. That's, in a nutshell, social independence. And there's some good come from that. The idea of individual states' rights, that although we have a federal government, each of our states, well, used to once upon a time, they had their own rights. Of course, we realize federal government grown, and a lot of states passed marriage amendment laws. Well, the federal government come away and done away with it. That's not right. But our states ought to have individual rights. George Washington, our first president, was part of this society. He was a Cavalier. He came from that society. To their benefit, a lot of them believed in being gentlemen. They believed in honor. They believed in doing the right thing. You did have that element. They weren't all mean, wicked, rich landowners just out for their own selves. A lot of them put a lot of stock into being honorable, and that was held in high esteem. And so you had the Cavaliers and their indentured servants. Then you had a migration of the Quakers, 1675 to 1725, about another 50 years. The Quakers came, they populated Pennsylvania and spread out from there. The Quakers are called sometimes the Society of Friends. Approximately 23,000 of them came, so that's pretty small compared to the Cavaliers and their 50,000. The most famous Quaker would be William Penn, who established Pennsylvania. He gave the gift of the Liberty Bell. The Liberty Bell's in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's inscribed with Leviticus 25:10, proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. And the Quakers believed in reciprocal liberty. And reciprocal liberty is this. It's based upon the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And so the idea of live and let live. That's what they believe. I won't bother you, you don't bother me. Reciprocal liberty. William Penn extended the rights of an Englishman to his whole colony, not just those that were tied in with the aristocrats and the upper, born people. In his colony in Pennsylvania, you had a right and title to your own lives, liberties, and estates. So you had liberties, you had your own land, you could own your own land. They believed in a representative government. See, a lot of these things in the Declaration of Independence and the founding of our country, they took the best of all these things and incorporated into our country and in our Constitution. So we got states' rights, you got a representative government, you got trial by jury. William Penn, they were big on that. The Quakers were the first ones to abolish slavery. And if you live by the golden rule, you would abolish slavery. Would you like to be a slave? Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. The Quakers were better friends to the Baptists than any of the others. The Puritans, the Anglicans for sure. To the Puritans, if you were a Baptist in their land, you were an outlaw. If you were a Baptist, you were not an Anglican, but you were something else, and you lived around the Anglicans, Virginia, North Carolina. If you were a Cavalier and somebody was not, then that person, if they were not a slave, they were poor white trash. Poor white trash is a historical term. I never knew that till studying. And there's an author, his name is G.A. Henty. And he wrote, I'm going to say the late 1800s, but he wrote historical novels for young people. And if you can find any of his novels, they're pretty good. I've read a few of them. And he's got one called With Lee in Virginia. And he puts a young person in a historical setting. And he went to great lengths to, like if you read about With Lee in Virginia, the actual places they were and the battles and all that. But he puts a young person in there. And he sort of tells their story going along. And so it's good for a history lesson. and it's interesting to young people. But in that book, it talked about the slaves, and the slaves were talking about these white people out here, and they weren't slave owners, and they worked on the plantations as well, and the slaves referred to them as poor white trash because those white people didn't have a master. And so it gives you just a little bit of, you certainly aren't going to hear that on the news. But that's, or you're not going to hear that a lot of times in school, but that's where that phrase comes from. That's what they called white people that were poor and didn't have a master. But anyway, the Quakers were better to the Baptist people. And then fourth, you had the Scots, Irish, and Northern Border English migration. And this took place from 1717 to 1775. These were mostly Presbyterian and Baptist people. But and I didn't really spend a whole lot of time on this last 2 semesters in church history, but the Baptists were there before the Presbyterians and the Anglicans and the Church of England and all that, the Baptist people. But when they migrated to America, they were mainly Presbyterians and Baptists and independent churches. And so you had that migration. They came for religious freedom and economic reasons. If you study about the 100 Years' War in England, it just riddled the country. And there's a lot of poverty and people fleeing the country because of that. But in that migration, 275,000. So you had 21,000, 50,000, and then 23,000. And then over a time period of 1717 to 1775, you had 275,000 people come to this country. That is by far the largest migration of all. And they came mainly through Philadelphia and Baltimore, Maryland. They came to those ports. And when they came to those ports, okay, Pennsylvania's already got people, Massachusetts already got people, Virginia's already got a whole lot of people there. When they came, nobody wanted them. They come over here, they were poor, they were fleeing war and religious persecution in their country. And so where did they end up coming? They ended up coming where nobody else wanted to go. They came south. They populated the Appalachians. They populated Southern Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, and the swamps, and Georgia and Florida. And then they went over the Appalachians, and they went into Kentucky. And that's what we've been reading about in our book. And so you have this huge influx of these people. And they came, and nobody wanted them. And they populated the southern states. And these are the people, when we read about Shoeball Stearns, and we read about him coming into North Carolina, and you read about a lot of them preachers. It talks about, you might remember talking about James Ireland and a lot of these others. They were Scotsmen, they were Irishmen, and they came over here. They were Welshmen, some of them. And so they populated the Bible Belt. I'm going to read a couple of quotes from a couple of different books. There's one called Albion Seed, 4 British Folkways in America. And there's another one called Freedom in America, Our Cultural Heritage by Matt Shipley. That was an article. But a couple of things these authors said about the Scots-Irish people. One of them said, they are the pattern upon which most stereotypes of Americans are based. Cracker, redneck, and Hoosier are epithets they carried with them from North Britain. So to be called a redneck, that come over here from Britain. They were called that before they got here. Here's something else. American country music is part of their cultural legacy. These people came and they traveled. They couldn't carry a piano. They might have a banjo. They might have I've seen all kinds of things. You go to some of these cultural museums and they'll have a string and a wash tub and a post on it. And I mean, there's people, they can make music out of anything. Dulcimers, banjos, these types of instruments. American country music is part of their cultural legacy, and they are America's warrior culture, from whom most of the men in combat arms throughout U.S. military history have descended. And so that's interesting as well. They believed, these Scots, Irish, and Northern Border Englishmen. The Northern Border Englishmen are different than people in Southern England, around London. And that's an interesting history to study out. But they believed in natural liberty. Natural liberty is the liberty that we believe in America. And it is the liberty that is outlined in the Declaration of Independence. Under natural liberty, you're only constrained by biblical laws of nature. And so, what does the Bible teach us? The Bible teaches us, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. There's some things that we know are wrong. The laws of nature teach us this. That's the kind of liberty that they believed in. That's the kind of language that we find in the Declaration of Independence. Another article said these people were fiercely independent. They did not want anything from the government or for the government to interfere in their lives. They upheld the principles of minimal government. And so we find that very thing embedded in the foundation of our government. The Constitution limits the government. This Scots-Irish influence won out in the founding of our country. That's where the great revivals took place. That's where God got a hold of a whole people, a whole region, and they influenced our whole country. They believed in light taxes and the right of armed resistance to authority in all cases which infringed liberty. And so they believed in the Second Amendment before there was a Second Amendment. And if you study the history of England, and you find, I think it took place in the 13 or 1400s, and the royalty over there, the kings over there, they had a law, and I can't remember right off the top of my head what it was called, but basically that the king could go in any home and do anything he wanted to, and like even taking somebody's wife if he saw her and he wanted her. And the Englishmen rose up against that, and they said a man's home is his castle. An Englishman ought to be as free in his home as the king is in his castle. And that mindset of those Northern Border Englishmen, the Scots, the Irish, that's where that comes from. And so a lot of interesting things when we study about this. I was studying, when I really first began to learn about a lot of this, and my family history is Scots-Irish, Scottish more than anything. Greer is Gregor, MacGregor. There's a lot of good stuff there. But I got studying about it, and I told my wife, I said, I've learned a lot of why I am the way I am. It was bred in me. A lot of people are the way they are. It's passed down from generation to generation to generation. The mindset that people have. Just think about it. Grandpa always said this, and Grandpa told his children and his children and his children. And so this mindset of this people, it shouldn't surprise us that it comes down through the centuries. And so a lot of us, not everybody, but you might pastor a bunch of independent, hard-headed, country music loving, rednecks. The Scots-Irish people, they had a thing that they call them clans, and the clans would accept other people in if the people would act right. They'd accept them in just like they were part of them. But if they got a dislike to them, they would not accept them in, and they'd do everything under their power to get rid of them. And I've noticed this in the mountain churches. Most churches do better with one of their own. Somebody was born and raised in that community. It is hard, especially I've noticed this down through the years over where I live, from somebody to come from out and come in and try to start dictating. You can't do that to mountain people. You can lead them, but you can't drive them. And if you try to drive them, they will buck up and they won't do nothing. But if you get out there and lead them, they will follow. That is a Scots Irish mentality that comes down through the generations. So if you and the Scots Irish were descendants of the Celtic people, and that's how they were. They would follow somebody, but they were and you'll find in England that war between England and Scotland, fighting back and forth. It's the same thing. They didn't want the king telling them what to do. And so they kept themselves separate all these years. And so that's just a little bit. If we will understand who we're ministering to, it'll help us. A lot of people, it's passed down through history the way they are. And so that comes from our heritage. David said this, "Yea, I have a goodly heritage." And so we ought to be thankful for the heritage that we have. And we look around, we see the people, we see the country that we have, the wars that have been fought, all these things. There is a historical reason behind that. So it'll help us if we'll just learn who we're ministering to. So that's one reason why we ought to study church history. It'll just help you be a better pastor. And so we'll leave off there tonight. It's the last night. We didn't deal with anything in the book. It's a great book. Brother Beller, he's gone on to be with the Lord since the last church history class we had, but it is a great book, and I get something out of it every time I read it. So we'll let you go with that. Appreciate everybody that brought snacks tonight, and hope you have a good summer. All right.